For those of you who remember reading the Laura Ingalls Wilder books, I suppose this is for you. So we drove out to Independence, Kansas to see one of the former residences, places where she lives. Now, of course, everything pretty much is gone except possibly the well. We don't know for sure that this was where they were, but it's a small area. They were on the census for this area, and supposedly hand dug a well. There is only one hand dug well in this area, and it's right behind this building, and we'll look at later in this video. The people are, as you'll see, very friendly here. So, that's really nice when you go somewhere and the staff is friendly. This is privately owned property. And originally it was not known that this was Laura's place. This came up later than the people who used to live here in this house moved.
Hey, how are you guys?
The ladies went on to offer to answer any questions that we may have, provided they know the answers. They would do their best to answer. And there's a lot that is not known about Laura, despite how many books she wrote. There are just a lot of unknowns about her family. As you can see, this is the gift shop. You can buy books, another Laura Ingalls thing here. Of course, the ladies offer information as well. And then, as you saw and will continue to see in this video, there's a lot of boards outside with information posted out or on them about whatever you happen to be seeing when you look around that particular board. That sculpture, that carving of Laura out front is nice. Not maybe life-size for the time when she was living at this location. We don't know the exact orientation. Of course, a lot of these trees weren't, well, the trees weren't there. There were no Osage orange trees here. It was just flat. Some of the landscape may have changed, but yes, there is certainly a lot of landscape that remains the same. The prairie grasses, of course, have changed. There was an Osage trail through here where the Osage Indians came, and that was mentioned in Laura's book. Yes, their cabin probably looked more like this one. Obviously not the house. There's a lot of modern things about some of these buildings. This is just a kind of replica idea of what their house would have looked like. It's pretty typical. Obviously, the boards weren't quite that good on top, on the roof there in the house that she lived in. It was an entirely different roof when Pod is. You can read in the books. And of course they had their wagon. Not quite like that. Now, the poor framing and the shaky video is an issue with how I had the camera mounted. I'm not trying to hide stuff. The video is terrible, and I apologize. So also there would have been the post office. There's actually a cot in the post office because sometimes they would have to spend the night there for one reason or another. But of course they did not live in the post office. This post office is basically period correct for the most part. There's electric and some things that obviously aren't correct. The cot is, you can kind of see the pillow there. It's next to the stove, like right next to the stove. And this schoolhouse, of course, would have been far away. And it was moved to this location at some time in the past just so people could see what it looked like. Lots of interesting stories about the schoolhouse, of course. A lot of the action in Laura's earlier books centered around the schoolhouse. Heck, even as she grew into adulthood, now there's been some, you can see a lot of this is not period correct on the schoolhouse, like the door. You'll see electric and things. There's been a gas line run through behind this property, and they kind of built up a little embankment to kind of hide that. It's an ugly orange thing. Yes, that electric was not there. It's just a little plot of land here, and then they have people coming by to look at it because it's Laura Ingalls. There was literally nothing left that they could find to indicate in this area where Laura Ingalls had been. Like I said, we don't know for sure that this was the actual area. It may or may not have been, but where else would it have been? The orientation of the house is not known. Yes, Laura talks about going down to the creek. There is a creek, but there's several creeks. And her idea of distance is relative, I suppose you'd say. You can see this is Kansas, so yes, it's flat, pretty much as Laura described. Yeah, it's another more modern door than Laura would have had. Not just when she lived here, but in her lifetime. Alright, so as I said earlier, the Osage were in the area. You can read all about it in Laura's books. The Indians, the Native Americans, that is, often offered color for the stories. You have various things that happen involve the Native Americans. So we talked a little bit about the schoolhouse. We've been around it. Let's take a look inside, if you don't mind. It's interesting to see how things were then and compare to how things are today. And we can see what changed. Now, a lot of this is period correct. Obviously, not everything. I'm not sure what this room was all about. Obviously, you need the stove. Mostly, school's only during the cold time of the year. The rest of the time, the kids are needed at home for one thing or another. You can see this, all the benches, a small school. Blackboard here, and if you saw that great big blackboard in the front of the room, it just goes the width of the room. I'm not sure about the piano and whatever that is, the other side being up there. You can't walk up that far. That's roped off. But of course, schools and churches were often the same building. Obviously, the light fixtures are not period correct. Now, some of these things are put in for our benefit. The posters, the display cases, things like that wagon. Obviously, those weren't there at the time. They could see them in real life. They didn't need miniatures and anything to tell about what they knew and lived on a daily basis. Yes, there's definitely interesting information. I strongly recommend visiting. The staff is great. This particular Laura Ingalls museum, it's fine. It's perhaps not as nice as Mansfield, but then Laura died at Mansfield. All they had to do was preserve what she had. This, they're trying to recreate what may have been from Laura's books. They don't really know for sure, one way or another. Laura wrote a story. It wasn't necessarily meant to be fact, the popular versions of the book. She does have some more factual books. More of those QR codes. If I wanted to look it up on the internet, I wouldn't have come out here. Obviously, this cabinet is more of a modern influence. Yes, some of the stuff they just didn't have the equipment to do. But although it was often better quality, they just, this has a very machined look to it on some of it. It took long enough to get here. I can't imagine doing this in a wagon. The ride would not have been that great. Now these trees again weren't here. These are Osage orange. I don't know what you're supposed to do with their fruit. A lot of the museum is obviously not period correct. This is a small parcel of property. The barns and the gas line behind, that's on property owned by somebody else. The barn owner is aware, and yeah, he kind of cooperates. He's got that quilt you'll see up on his barn. Yeah, and that electric is period correct. These animals again are on somebody else's property. Of course, they weren't here back then. The trees, the fences, it was just grass and dust and rock. I don't think Pa ever had anything as grand as those barns back there. Although not all of their houses were tiny. There's the quilt. Obviously the propane tank is not period correct. One of the things you want to do when you're out someplace like this and shooting video, you want to make sure not to interfere with other people's experience. So I'm trying to be mindful of that. That brown building is the restrooms. Obviously that was not here. It is not period correct at all. The outhouse, and then there's some lawn benches that are useless. I mean, who could sit that low? They're unusable. I guess the car's there for the staff. That's the only thing I can figure. Obviously the picnic benches are not period correct. And let's look at that hand-dug well. This is how they located the property. As I said, there was no other hand-dug well in the area. This one was not a hand-dug, as Pa's was. This was covered over. It's sealed now. You can't get in there. I wish they had made it with like a thick piece of glass over it so you'd look down in. It'd be nice to see if there's actually water in it or not, especially when it's this dry. But the well's 20 feet. Now, having some experience digging in this type of an area by hand, 20 feet is very deep. But to me, 20 feet, I had a well. 20 feet doesn't seem like you'd get water, especially here.
but I'm not volunteering to dig any deeper.
I never remember seeing that Mary's middle name was Amelia. I'm sure it's in the lineage on the um, fly in the book, but or the one of the early pages in the book where it shows the lineage. I'm sure it has middle names in there, but honestly, nothing against Mary. In the book, she was such a blah character. She did what was right, or did little or nothing. Of course, Laura was the one telling the story, and everything centered around Laura. But Laura was likely to do or say the wrong thing at the wrong time. That's much more interesting, especially when you're not getting in trouble for what she's doing. I'm just reading about it in a book. But Mary, I never really identified with Mary at all. So yep, there's the quilt that Mary would have been able to make after she was blind, and being blind didn't really change that much about Mary in the books. Obviously, it probably changed the direction of her life somewhat, but we don't know that. And just look how flat that is. There's just nothing. And these trees, of course, were not there, but even with the trees that they've added, the wind's gonna blow. It's just hot, dry. I don't know why they would have wanted to come live here. Maybe they didn't realize what they were coming to. And of course, if there was a bad decision, Paul made it. It seemed like